Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Mess. So today we're continuing a series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project, and I got a really fun, really random, and really exciting episode for you guys this evening, because over the weekend, Robert or FPGA Zoom's boss updated the Nintendo 64 core again in a way that you will think is very unlikely but makes a lot of logical sense. Now we have full NES emulation implementation within the MiSTer FPGA core using an emulator written for Nintendo 64 hardware, like if you're actually using a real console. You think of something like Castlevania on the Nintendo 64 and you go to Castlevania 64 or its sequel Legacy of Darkness, two awesome games. But that's not the type of Castlevania we're talking about this evening. We're talking about the type that launched the entire franchise, the original Castlevania on the Nintendo Entertainment System. And that all comes down to the Nintendo 64's processor and its MIPS instruction set. MIPS isn't just a rabbit in Super Mario 64, it's also named after the processor architecture. Now every single processor uses a different instruction set, and while you watch fun footage of Castlevania running on the Nintendo 64 core, I get to get a little bit nerdy and talk about that. Whether you're using ARM, whether you're using PowerPC, x86, anything under the sun, they all function on instruction sets. It's basically everything the processor can do to be a processor. Something like the NES emulator written for real Nintendo 64 hardware requires the instruction set of the Nintendo 64 processor to function not just with having all the instruction sets, but also with correct timings and everything else you would need for a processor to pretend to be another processor. That is what software emulation is, and this is FPGA doing software emulation. The reason this is so important is it goes to aid in fixing bugs in the core and making sure that the processor instructions in the FPGA are all functioning as they should. The other fun part is because you do get all of the different VI implementations and otherwise in the core, you can actually articulate the image a little bit differently than if you were playing on the NES core. Now don't get me wrong, there's no reason to actually use this versus the NES core we have on MiSTer. That is outstanding and that's how you should be playing. This comes down more to getting the core in a better state. When Robert was first developing this core and there was a lot of things not working, it actually came down to a bug and a freeze in emulation of Commander Keen that he fixed that allowed a lot more progress to be made. If you can't get something to run in this emulator, that points to a certain problem, because obviously all of the emulation for this on real Nintendo 64 hardware is coming off of the CPU. If it's running in the core, that means the CPU instruction set and all of the code underlying it in FPGA would be correct. Now we're moving over to a recommendation from Octane actually, and a big thanks to Andy D for helping out with these captures. I've never heard of this game before. I played it after I did this voiceover. It is definitely a ton of fun, and honestly just seeing this work in the core is a ton of fun. This feels like nothing short of magic. Robert has created an entire Nintendo 64 in FPGA code, and he now has buttoned up a lot of the code to the point where it can run an NES emulator written for real hardware. That's layers of inception and layers of the onion deeper than anyone would ever expect this sort of thing to get. But that is how these things get made. Getting this to run is so hyper important because it is, I'm sure, going to go forward and help the core improve, fix bugs, as well as tighten up some of the timings, which are still being done in the background by Robert. But again, sometimes these things feel nothing short of magic. No one would ever expect this to work, but here it is today. If you download the most recent core, you can emulate pretty much every single NES game under the sun. Now do be aware the emulator in use doesn't support every single mapper, so you might get an error saying unsupported mapper. That's not the core having an issue, that's actually the software emulator in and of itself. And I'm sure that software emulator will be updated in the future to probably take care of things like that. But think of it this way. The NES runs off a 6502 processor that uses a MOS 6502 instruction set. The Nintendo 64 works off that MIPS CPU with a MIPS instruction set. They are similar yet completely different at the same time, but having both instruction sets correct in the software emulator as well as in the FPGA core allows for things like NES emulation to actually work within the Nintendo 64 core. And when you know your instruction set is working for software emulation, you know your FPGA code that is recreating the processor for the Nintendo 64 in MiSTer is working correctly as well. It's basically just a way to confirm what's working is how it should. And I will say the sound quality on both of these fronts is outstanding as well. 30 seconds and I'll come back and show you a lot more fun examples of just what's going on. Sounds pretty good to me, but honestly, something like Mario running on Nintendo 64 allows for Super Mario 64 to run on Nintendo 64. Because you know the software emulation is working, you know the FPGA code to implement the Nintendo 64's processor is also functioning as intended, and that is no small feat. Obviously, it is antiquated hardware at this point in time, but when this came out back in the 90s, it was some of the most cutting-edge hardware you could get in a home console, and obviously it's miles ahead of the Nintendo Entertainment System and uses a completely different CPU with a completely different instruction set. But these are basically proof of concept tests. This is a good way to confirm that the work being done on the core is fundamentally improving the core. It's a way to check things. And if you're not technically minded and just like watching the news, think about it this way. You're trying to bake a loaf of bread. You get a recipe, you put all the ingredients in a bowl, you stir them together, you knead them, and you put them in the oven. About 45 minutes later, you open the oven up and you see whether or not you have bread. Seeing if NES Emulation works on the Nintendo 64 core is like checking to see if you have bread. You have followed all the directions, you're trying to recreate something, and if what comes out in the end is NES Emulation or a really good sourdough loaf, you knew you did everything correctly, and the result is positive. And honestly, I just kind of had a bread reference because I had pizza for dinner, and I was kind of having bread on the brain. But something like Kirby 64 is just such an incredible game and works so well, but even as of a couple weeks ago, Robert re-improved the core to fix a little bit of a visual glitch at the bottom of the screen that was drawing a few too many pixels. That could be down to so many different reasons, but trying to track down every single last bug is very difficult, but testing on something like NES Emulation lets him know that the CPU implementation at least is functioning exactly as he expects it to, because not every single bug is easy to find. There's some things that are not repeatable, and when you try to repeat them, they freeze or screw up in a completely independently new way every single time. Those things are impossible to test, but whether or not something like Shadowgate will launch and run on an NES emulator is something that is relatively consistent. If it launches, it launches. If it doesn't, that means there's something wrong within the instruction set code under the FPGA, and that's why things like this are so incredibly important. And if you do start testing this again yourself, remember what I said earlier, not every single game runs in the emulator, but that doesn't have anything to do with the Nintendo 64 core. The emulator is functioning, it's just saying that Neon 64 does not support that mapper type. Hopefully those do get improved in the future. But the fun part is it's just kind of a party trick. This is not anything that people are going to play when they want to play their NES games. Of course, like I said, we have the NES and Famicom Disk System core, which is incredible on MiSTer FPGA already. And this is a proof of concept that something is working well enough that it is adhering exactly to what you would expect off original hardware, because you can run this emulator off a flash card on a real Nintendo 64 and get an awesome result. And one more taste of the music, because I do love this soundtrack, it is quite good. Really good soundtrack and sounds great on the core, but sounds great on the software emulator. This really is just multiple layers of absolute weirdness and absolute fun, because who would have thought that Nintendo 64 would have worked on MiSTer FPGA, and who would have thought that NES emulation on a Nintendo 64 core on MiSTer FPGA would have worked? But here we are today, and both of those statements are true, both are working, and it's just so much fun to watch. And I know this isn't the usual Nintendo 64 preview video. It doesn't really fix any particular bugs in any Nintendo 64 game that would be fundamentally keeping you from playing, but this in fact did fix one freezing problem apparently in Mia Hamm Soccer of all things. So if you're a big Mia Hamm fan, that has been improved by this, and people are still hunting this down. But it's one more step in the walk to get a perfect Nintendo 64 core on MiSTer FPGA. This was long thought to be the impossible core, and not only is it possible, it's now possible to emulate a Nintendo Entertainment System within the Nintendo 64 core, and that is just absolutely one of the weirdest and most fun things I have seen. But next time Robert updates the core, I'll do another update video. Leave me some tests down below, games you want to see retested, but I'll see you soon. Go play some Mario, the 8-bit version. Bye bye!